Well, good evening, everybody. Carrying on with part two of a look at prosecutorial misconduct as applied in closing arguments. So let's just jump straight in, shall we? Should be all ready to go. I think we got as far as here, which was part two. So this is an article written by Michael Cicchini. Chapter 2, recognizing improper arguments. Battling prosecutorial misconduct in closing argument begins with learning what constitutes an improper argument. Part 1 of this article set forth the bounds of a legally proper argument. In theory, then, anything outside of those bounds is improper, but such a formulation is not easily applied in practice. Therefore, the following sections provide concrete examples of improper arguments grouped into general categories, the goal of which is to make it easier for the criminal defense lawyer to recognize prosecutorial misconduct when he or she hears it at trial. It is important, however, to keep three things in mind. First, this article makes no attempt to list all examples or even to identify all categories of improper argument. The variations of misconduct in closing arguments are far too numerous to be easily catalogued in a single article. Second, while there is broad agreement across jurisdictions as to what constitutes an improper argument, the determination sometimes depends on the law of the specific federal circuit, state, or federal district within a state. And third, for some types of prosecutorial argument, what qualifies as improper may depend upon the facts of the particular case. Given this, every defense lawyer must become familiar with the law applicable to his or her case and, equally important, must understand how that law applies to different factual scenarios. Keeping these caveats in mind, what follows are examples of common but often improper closing arguments. Okay. Section A, testifying. You're damned if you do. As late as the 1960s, some prosecutors were able to win convictions by preventing defendants from testifying at trial. Today, however, courts recognize a defendant's constitutional right to testify in his or her own defense. And to ensure this right has real meaning, courts often instruct jurors that you should not discredit the testimony just because the defendant is charged with a crime. Yet prosecutors have developed arguments to accomplish exactly what the law prohibits. They urge jurors to disregard the defendant's testimony simply because he or she is the defendant. For example, one prosecutor argued to the jury, what's her interest, bias or prejudice? Well, she's the defendant here. She stands a chance of getting convicted. That's one very large reason she should have of trying to slant her testimony, of trying to shift the blame away. It's not pleasant to be convicted, especially at her age. In a different case, the prosecutor similarly argued, what is his interest, bias or prejudice? Well, he's the one on trial here. You recall his testimony. He's a 17-year-old male attending high school, getting ready to enter into adulthood. Do you think he'd want to go through the rest of his life with a conviction? In both cases, the Illinois court held that this type of argument was improper, as it implied that the defendant lied simply because of his or her status as a defendant. In other words, arguing that a defendant's testimony should be discredited, dismissed, or ignored because he or she is the defendant is, in substance, the equivalent to preventing him or her from testifying in the first place, something the Supreme Court has already deemed unconstitutional. The prosecutor must not be allowed to accomplish the same end by different means. Worse yet, this prosecutorial argument violates an even more important constitutional principle, the presumption of innocence. This can be demonstrated in three simple but irrefutable steps. First, in any criminal case involving the defendant's testimony, the prosecutor takes the position that the defendant is guilty, but the defendant testifies that he or she is innocent. Second, to argue that the defendant is lying or slanting his or her testimony or shifting blame because of his or her status as a defendant necessarily implies that the defendant is guilty. That, after all, is the whole point of the prosecutor's argument. And third, to argue that a person is guilty merely because he or she has been charged with a crime is blatantly unconstitutional, as such arguments diminish the defendant's fundamental right to the presumption of innocence, whether based on the defendant's right to testify or his or her right to a presumption of innocence. Arguments that the defendant's testimony should be disregarded based solely on his or her status as the defendant are improper. Defense counsel must be able to recognize when the prosecutor is engaging in misconduct by making such arguments. Section B, testifying, you're damned if you don't. Yeah. For a variety of reasons, many defendants choose to exercise their constitutional right to remain silent at trial. It is not everyone who can safely venture on the witness stand, though entirely innocent of the charge against him. And the law is clear. A defendant has a right to a jury instruction that his silence is not evidence of his guilt. Yet, in cases where defendants elect to remain silent, prosecutors are quick to spin this silence to the government's advantage. Modern prosecutors normally do not explicitly argue that a defendant's silence at trial means that he or she is guilty. Such a bold claim would be a blatant, but not necessarily reversible error. Instead, prosecutors seem to keep coming up with arguments which have a double meaning, thus maintaining the thrust of the message, while at the same time giving the abusive prosecutors plausible, or in many cases implausible, deniability. Improper comments on the defendant's decision not to testify appear in seemingly infinite variety. In one recent case, a prosecutor began rebuttal argument by walking across the courtroom, facing defendant and declaring in a loud voice while raising both arms to point at and gesture toward the defendant, "Just tell us where you are. That's all we are asking, Youre." In a more subtle example, another prosecutor argued to a jury that God forbid you should believe a police officer whose testimony went uncontradicted by these defendants. Similarly, another prosecutor argued that there were only two people present for an alleged assault, sexual assault, and the rape victim was the only person to have testified concerning events occurring in the room where the defendant had raped her. In perhaps the height of craftiness, another prosecutor argued that the jurors that they to the jurors that they should not take into consideration anyway the fact that the defendant did not testify, which the court held was a disguised but deliberate attempt to call attention to the defendant's failure to testify. Regardless of the form of the argument, however, any direct, indirect, or even disguised comment on the defendant's silence violates the defendant's due process rights and the Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination and are therefore improper. Liar, liar, and other name calling. Prosecutors sometimes argue that defendants are not believable simply because they are charged with a crime. Other times, however, prosecutors are more direct and simply call the defendant or the defense witness a liar or brand the person with equally harmful labels. In some jurisdictions, calling the defendant a liar is, at least in theory, per se improper, as it is considered an inflammatory label. In other jurisdictions, prosecutors may get away with such name calling if it is closely tied to evidence adduced at trial. For example, when the witness told 4 different stories when testifying, it may be proper to discuss those conflicting stories and then argue that the witness is the biggest liar in the county. That is, it may be permissible to call the defendant or a witness a liar if conflicts in evidence make such an assertion a fair inference. Prosecutors are often creative and build upon the words lie or lying or liar. One prosecutor went well beyond the pale in closing argument when discussing the defendant's testimony. Joseph Goebbels, who was a propaganda minister for Germany back at the time of Adolf Hitler, had a theory. He believed that you should lie to the people, but that you shouldn't lie with small lies because you can get caught in small lies. What you should do is you should lie big. Come up with a big lie because that's something that you might be able to have people buy, is the big lie. Of course, at the time, it was that the Jews were responsible for everything that was wrong in the world and they should be exterminated. Well, the defense in this case is nothing but a big lie. Wow. Most prosecutors aren't brash enough to invoke Nazi Germany and then strain to find a way to associate the defendant with it. Many prosecutors will, however, brand the defendant with other negative labels in addition to that of liar, depending on the facts of the case and the nature of the prosecutor's argument. Name calling such as dope pusher, hoodlum, and unpredictable animal could very well be considered inflammatory, improper, and even reversible error. Disparaging the defense lawyer. When prosecutors aren't criticizing the defendant or the defendant's witnesses, they are often disparaging the defendant's lawyer. This type of argument is improper because it can prejudice the defendant by inducing the jury to give greater weight to the government's view of the case. Attacks on defense counsel can take several forms, beginning with criticism disguised or compliment. For example, in a classic case of false flattery, one prosecutor backhandedly complimented defense counsel on his skill in confusing the alleged victim of a sexual assault when cross-examining her, and then distinguished the dishonorable goals of the defense lawyer from the noble objectives of the government and the judge. More commonly, prosecutors go after defense counsel via a more direct route. Instead of arguing about the evidence, many prosecutors have attacked the personal integrity of defense counsel by suggesting that counsel was not being truthful. Not mincing words, one prosecutor told the jury that the defense lawyer is either confused or she's lying or trying to mislead you. Such misconduct in closing argument evidences an excessive preoccupation with obtaining a conviction at any cost. And when prosecutors employ this strategy, the state's closing argument may cause one to wonder who is on trial, the defendant or the defense counsel. In perhaps the most extreme and literal example of putting the defense lawyer on trial, one prosecutor in an incest case suggested that defense counsel was also guilty of incest. Another variation on this anti-defense lawyer theme does not attack the defense lawyer as an individual, but instead attacks his or her role in the criminal justice system. For example, one prosecutor argued that while the prosecutor's job is to determine whether I believe a person is guilty and whether I think the prosecution is just, the defense counsel's job is to get his client off the hook. That's his only job here, not to see justice is done, but to see that his client is acquitted. This common twist on this form of improper argument allows prosecutors to kill two birds with one stone, anointing themselves as justice seekers while at the same time branding defense lawyers as obfuscators. Prosecutors continue to make these and similar arguments, even though courts have repeatedly stated that such disparaging remarks directed at defense counsel are reprehensible. In a broader sense, such remarks also detract from the dignity of judicial proceedings. As such, regardless of the prosecutor's angle, all forms of argument directed at defense counsel should be considered improper. I think we will leave it there, having got to item E. I'm going to stop that there. I thought that was a particularly interesting series of passages from Michael Cicchini. Led everyone. I thought of Ken Kratz, Tom Fowler, and Jerry and Dean. And I think Michael's absolutely spot on. It is pretty terrible what the prosecution that is allowed to say, not just in closing arguments, but in general. Anyway, as usual, if you can give me your thoughts in the comments below, that would be great. And we'll carry on with part 3 very shortly, possibly tomorrow, maybe, but yeah, sometime very soon. Okay, catch you all again soon. Better take Jock for his constitutional. Catch you later. Bye for now.